on Saturday, March 21st, 2026, posted a message on Truth Social that was not the kind of message that diplomats write, and that was not designed to leave any room for interpretation. He wrote, "If Iran does not fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first." It contained no softening phrases, no references to international law, no acknowledgement of the negotiations that were simultaneously being conducted through Pakistani back channels. It was the language of a man who had decided that the negotiations were moving too slowly, and that the only thing that would accelerate them was the threat of destruction, specific enough and credible enough to make the Iranian government's internal calculus change. And the question that hung over those 48 hours, and that has hung over every subsequent ultimatum and deadline and extension that Trump has issued in the months since, is whether the threat was real, whether Iran believed it was real, and whether the pattern of ultimatums followed by extensions, followed by new ultimatums that has characterized Trump's management of the Iran war since its beginning is a negotiating strategy, or a demonstration that neither side has found the combination of pressure and concession that produces a signed document. The war that produced this situation had begun less than a month before Trump posted that March 21st ultimatum. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, struck military and nuclear facilities across the country, and triggered an Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz that cut global energy traffic through the world's most important maritime choke point to a fraction of its pre-conflict level. Trump had described the opening strikes in a televised address as a spectacular military success, and in the narrow sense that Iranian air defenses were unable to stop the bombing, and that the IRGC and the nuclear infrastructure at Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan took substantial damage, the description was accurate. But Iran's response, the closure of the Hormuz and the economic weapon it represented, imposed costs on the global economy that no military victory over Iranian air defense systems could offset. And within 3 weeks of the war's beginning, the oil prices, the fuel costs, the inflation readings, and the disruption to global shipping had created a domestic political problem for the Trump administration that the military success alone could not solve. The ultimatums began when it became clear that military pressure alone was not going to produce an Iranian decision to reopen the strait, and Trump's response to that clarity was to escalate the pressure through language designed to make the cost of noncompliance as vivid and immediate as possible. On March 23rd, Bloomberg was already publishing an assessment of what the ultimatum's mixed record of follow-through told the world about its credibility, noting that Trump had a decidedly mixed record on carrying through with threats. On March 26th, Trump issued a 10-day ultimatum, giving Iran 10 days to either make a deal or open the Strait of Hormuz, warning that all hell will rain down if the deadline was not met. On April 4th, Trump reiterated the 10-day ultimatum on Truth Social, and a day later posted that Tuesday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time was the new deadline, extending it by 24 hours and threatening Iran's power plants and bridges in language that included profanity and ended with praise be to Allah. On April 5th, Iran rejected the ceasefire proposal that regional mediators had put forward for a 45-day ceasefire and reopening of the strait, calling the American proposal one-sided and unfair. On April 6th, an Iranian drone struck a telecommunications company building in Fujairah in the UAE. Production operations were suspended at the Barouj petrochemicals plant in the Ruwais industrial area of Abu Dhabi after an Iranian strike the same day. And the IRGC intelligence chief, Major General Sayed Majid Kademi, was killed in a strike in Tehran that Iranian and Israeli statements both confirmed, adding another decapitation strike to the toll of the war's opening weeks. Then, on April 7th, at 6:32 in the evening Eastern Time, 90 minutes before the 8 o'clock deadline that Trump had set for the resumption of the bombing campaign, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir asked Trump to hold off, and Trump held off, posting the ceasefire announcement that described Iran as having agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz as a condition of the 2-week pause in American strikes. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed within hours that if attacks against Iran were halted, Iran agreed to the ceasefire. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said he believed the ceasefire would hold. And in Inqilab Square in Tehran, people gathered waving Iranian flags in scenes that circled the world, because the announcement of any pause in the bombing was something that the Iranian population, which had been living under American airstrikes for 5 weeks, received with relief that the subsequent complications of the negotiations could not entirely erase. What followed the April 8th ceasefire was not the swift resolution that Trump's language had suggested was imminent. The ceasefire held in the broad sense that the large-scale bombing campaign was suspended, but it was punctuated by the skirmishes and violations that both sides accused the other of initiating, and the Strait of Hormuz did not return to anything approaching pre-war traffic levels, because the mines that Iran had deployed in the channel remained, and because the insurance companies covering commercial shipping refused to return to normal coverage until demining was verified, and because Iran continued to control which vessels it permitted to transit on a ship-by-ship basis. On April 21st, Trump said he had extended the truce at Pakistan's request to allow time for an Iranian proposal to be submitted. On April 22nd, American officials described infighting within the Iranian government as a reason why the talks were not moving faster, a statement that revealed both the American assessment of Iran's post-Khamenei political fragmentation and the genuine uncertainty about who had the authority to make binding commitments on Tehran's behalf. On April 29th, told Axios in an exclusive interview that he had rejected Iran's latest offer and that the American blockade would stay until a nuclear deal was reached, adding the phrase, "They are choking like a stuffed pig," which was the language of a president who had decided, at least in that moment, that the economic pressure of the dual blockade was working in America's favor, and that Iran's internal economic distress was a reason to hold firm rather than make concessions. The present situation, as of Tuesday, May 27, 2026, contains elements that distinguish it from every previous moment in the negotiations, while also containing elements that are recognizably continuous with the pattern of ultimatums and extensions and largely negotiated announcements and Iranian pushback that has characterized the entire conflict. The new ultimatum that the title of this video describes, demand that Tehran sign the final agreement or face a permanent blockade, reflects a specific assessment by the Trump administration, that the framework negotiations have reached the point at which continued delay serves Iranian interests more than American ones, that the 60-day window for nuclear talks, which the Memorandum of Understanding is supposed to create, is being eroded by the failure to sign the memorandum itself, and that the domestic political cost of the fuel prices and the disrupted shipping and the congressional pressure and the approaching midterms has reached a level that makes accepting a permanent blockade as the alternative to a signed agreement politically more sustainable than it would have been at any earlier point in the conflict. Whether that assessment is correct, whether Iran's calculation agrees with that the costs of continued impasse now outweigh the costs of signing, is the question that the 48 hours the ultimatum provides are supposed to answer. Iran's response to the latest ultimatum has followed the same architecture that its responses to previous ultimatums have followed, which is to simultaneously signal flexibility through the foreign ministry and signal firmness through the IRGC and the affiliated media. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei said that Tehran was engaging with Oman on the Strait of Hormuz question, and that the strait had nothing to do with the United States, which is the foreign ministry's way of saying that Iran is open to discussing the strait's management with regional partners, while maintaining that American demands about the strait's status under international law are not a legitimate basis for negotiation. Tasnim news agency, which reflects the IRGC's institutional perspective, reported that the Strait of Hormuz would not return to its pre-war status under any agreement, which is the hardest possible statement of the position that every Iranian official across the spectrum has been maintaining, which is that whatever happens with the war's resolution, the pre-February 28th reality in which the strait operated under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea without Iranian management conditions is not a reality that Iran is willing to restore. The Axios exclusive reporting on what is inside the deal that is close to signing, published on May 24th, contains the most detailed account available of the American understanding of the agreement's terms, and it is worth examining carefully because it reveals the architecture of what the administration considers an acceptable outcome. According to a senior administration official who spoke to Axios, Iran would clear the mines it deployed in the Strait of Hormuz, with the speed of the demining directly determining the speed of American concessions, in a principle that the official described as relief for performance. The United States would lift its blockade on Iranian ports and issue sanctions waivers allowing Iran to sell its oil freely in exchange for the demining, with the pace of sanctions relief tied proportionately to the pace of demonstrated Iranian compliance. Iran wanted funds unfrozen immediately and permanent sanctions relief, but the American position is that those benefits would only be delivered after tangible concessions were made, meaning after the mines were cleared and the shipping lanes restored in ways that the demining verification process could confirm. The official acknowledged that the sanctions waivers would be a boon to Iran's economy, but said they would also give significant relief to the global oil market, framing the Iranian economic benefit as an acceptable side effect of an outcome that served American strategic and economic interests. The framework is designed so that the American concessions are always conditional on Iranian compliance rather than preceding it, which is what the trust but verify on steroids description means in practice and what Trump's relief for performance principle captures in its most compressed form. The nuclear question remains the dimension of the negotiations that the memorandum of understanding is deliberately deferring rather than resolving. Iran's foreign ministry said explicitly that, at this stage, nuclear details are not being discussed, and that the 14-point memorandum is focused on ending the war. This deferral reflects the pragmatic judgment of both negotiating teams that the nuclear question cannot be resolved in the context of an ongoing war, that it requires the kind of sustained technical and political engagement that is only possible once the active fighting has stopped, and the acute economic pressure of the Hormuz closure has been reduced enough that both sides have the bandwidth to engage with a question that is going to take months rather than weeks to negotiate. Public position remains that Iran must never obtain a nuclear weapon, and that Iran must commit publicly to never seeking one, and Iranian officials have equally publicly maintained that Iran's nuclear program is a matter of national sovereignty that no agreement with the United States can permanently constrain in ways that do not apply to other nuclear powers in the region, including Israel. These positions are not being negotiated right now. They are being shelved into the 60-day second phase of the framework, and whether that phase produces an agreement or produces another round of ultimatums and extensions depends on factors that neither the Memorandum of Understanding nor the 48-hour ultimatum can resolve. Statement to Israel's Channel 13 news correspondent Neria Krauss, given during the earlier ultimatum period in late March, is perhaps the most unfiltered expression of the psychological framework within which he is managing the entire Iran file. When Krauss asked him about the ultimatum and whether Iran would cave into it, Trump said, "You're going to find out soon," and then described what would follow in 3 words: total decimation of Iran. He then said, "It is going to work out very good," which is the characteristic transition from maximalist threat to breezy confidence in the outcome, the movement from "we will obliterate your power plants" to "it is going to be great," performed without irony or apparent awareness of the distance between those two registers. The combination of genuine threat and genuine optimism that characterizes Trump's communications about Iran is not a contradiction, but a coherent psychological posture, the posture of a person who believes that extreme pressure and extreme flexibility, deployed simultaneously, will eventually produce the capitulation that makes the great outcome possible. The question that the 3 months since February 28th have not yet answered is whether Iran's leadership, fragmented and under pressure and internally divided about what it can and cannot accept, responds to that posture in the way it believes it will. The 48-hour ultimatum for the final agreement carries a specific weight that the earlier ultimatums did not carry, because it comes after 3 months of conflict, after the ceasefire, after the largely negotiated announcement, after the Sunday walking back, and after the accumulated economic pressure that has been building on both sides since the Hormuz closed. The 240 ships that were waiting for Iran's permission to pass as of Saturday are the most concrete measure of what the continued impasse costs the global economy every day. The memorandum is not signed, and every day those ships wait the political pressure on both governments increases. American families paid higher fuel prices over Memorial Day weekend than they have paid in years, and they paid those prices on a holiday weekend that is the most politically visible moment of the year for American fuel costs. Because Memorial Day travel is when the price at the pump is a topic on every evening news broadcast and every kitchen table conversation. The Iranian families who are paying more for food and medicine because the same blockade that is keeping the 240 ships waiting is also keeping Iranian imports from flowing are experiencing the same kind of daily accumulating pressure from a different direction. Told his negotiators on Sunday not to rush. On Tuesday, the 48-hour ultimatum says the final agreement must be signed or the permanent blockade takes effect. The distance between those two statements is the distance this entire war has been traveling since February 28th. The distance between a president who says time is on my side and a president who says you have 48 hours, both of them being the same president, managing the same negotiation in the same week. Whether the ultimatum produces a signature or produces an extension or produces a resumption of the bombing campaign that Trump threatened to launch 90 minutes before the April 7th deadline is the question that the 48 hours will answer. Iran's foreign ministry and the IRGC and the Tasnim news agency and the Fars news agency will all say different things during those 48 hours. And the Pakistani mediators and the Qatari channel and Steve Witkoff will be carrying messages between capitals, and the oil markets will trade on every signal that emerges. And the 240 ships will continue to wait, and the American families will pay their fuel prices, and the Iranian families will pay their food prices, and the distance between largely negotiated and signed will either close in the next 48 hours, or it will remain open for another round of extensions and ultimatums and largely negotiated announcements, which is the rhythm that this war has been keeping since the first ultimatum was posted on Truth Social on the 21st of March. The permanent blockade that Trump is threatening as the alternative to a signed agreement is itself a significant escalation of the American position, because it transforms what has been a temporary wartime measure into a declared long-term policy, and the distinction matters both legally and strategically. A temporary naval blockade imposed in the context of an active armed conflict has a legal framework under international law which is contested, but which has a body of precedent and doctrine built around it. A permanent blockade declared outside the context of an active conflict is a different legal and political category, one that would require the United States to maintain a sustained naval enforcement presence in the Gulf indefinitely, to intercept and turn back or detain vessels attempting to call at Iranian ports indefinitely, and to sustain the diplomatic and political costs of that enforcement indefinitely, all while the global oil markets continue to price in the disruption to Iranian exports, and while the governments of the Gulf states that host American military facilities continue to manage the domestic political costs of their association with an American policy that is blocking a neighboring country's trade. The permanent blockade threat is designed to make the cost of not signing the memorandum of understanding appear higher than the cost of signing it, and it will achieve that objective or not, depending entirely on whether the Iranian calculation of the relative costs agrees with the specific events of the 48 hours from the current ultimatum are unfolding against a background of the broader regional situation that has been developing throughout the conflict, and that constrains the options of every actor involved. Israel has continued to strike targets in Lebanon and in what remains of Hezbollah's infrastructure south of the Litani River, maintaining the secondary front of the conflict that the war opened when the strikes on Iran began in February. And that has not found a ceasefire parallel to the Iran-America track being negotiated through Pakistan and Qatar, Gulf states, including the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which have been struck by Iranian missiles and drones during the conflict, and which have been hosting American military facilities that became targets of Iranian retaliation, are watching the 48-hour ultimatum with a specific anxiety, because any resumption of American strikes on Iran following a failed ultimatum will almost certainly produce another round of Iranian retaliation against Gulf infrastructure. And the governments of those states have made clear in private communications to Washington that they want the conflict resolved through the memorandum of understanding rather than through another bombing campaign. MBS called for de-escalation publicly. The UAE absorbed missile strikes and continued calling for negotiations. Both governments understand that whatever the deal's imperfections, the alternative being threatened in the 48-hour ultimatum is more immediately costly to them than to the United States. The Axios reporting that S key principle in the agreement is relief for performance is the formulation that tells you most accurately what the American negotiating position has been since the ceasefire began and what the 48-hour ultimatum is designed to enforce. Relief for performance means that the United States will provide economic benefits to Iran, proportionate to and conditional on Iran's demonstrated compliance with the deal's terms, starting with a demining of the Hormuz and working through the sequence of sanctions relief and asset unfreezing and nuclear framework engagement that the Memorandum of Understanding envisions. Iran's position, which has been stated repeatedly, and which the Fars news agency restated after Trump's Saturday largely negotiated announcement, is that the strait remains under Iranian management and will not return to its pre-war status. The gap between relief for performance, in which the strait returns to something approaching freedom of navigation as the mines are cleared and the IRGC's ship-by-ship permission regime ends, and the Hormuz remains under Iranian management, in which the mines are cleared but the IRGC's management of transit conditions continues in some modified form, is the gap that the 48 hours are supposed to close. Whether they close, it depends on whether Iran's internal power structure, the foreign ministry and the IRGC and the parliament and the clerical establishment, has reached a consensus about what it is willing to accept, or whether the 48 hours will end with another extension, another Truth Social post, another round of the pattern that has been repeating since March 21st. Said on March 21st that power plants would be obliterated. He extended the deadline. He said all hell will rain down. He extended the deadline again. He said the whole country will be blown up. He extended the deadline to April 7th at 8 o'clock Eastern. Pakistan intervened. The ceasefire was announced at 6:32. Iran's foreign minister confirmed it. People gathered in Enqilab Square. Then the ceasefire was punctuated by skirmishes. The largely negotiated announcement came on May 23rd. Iran disputed it on May 24th. Said time is on our side on May 25th. The 48-hour ultimatum for the final agreement came on May 27th. The ships are still waiting. The fuel prices are still high. The Memorandum of Understanding is still a framework awaiting Iranian approval, rather than a signed document, and has given Tehran 48 hours to change that or face a permanent blockade that the previous 90 days have demonstrated is something both sides are paying a very high price to maintain. This is where the Iran war stands on Tuesday, May 27, 2026, and the 48 hours that follow are the next chapter in a story that has been told through truth, social posts, and IRGC threats and Pakistani mediators, and Qatari back channels, and oil market reactions and fuel prices at Memorial Day gas stations. A story that is not yet finished and whose ending is not yet visible from the place where it currently stands. The congressional dimension of the pressure that is being applied to the administration during this 48-hour window is not separate from the ultimatum, but part of the same political calculation that produced it. The Senate bill requiring congressional authorization for continued military operations against Iran has been advancing with bipartisan support, and its advancement is itself a form of 48-hour pressure on the White House, because a president who cannot secure congressional backing for a permanent blockade cannot credibly threaten to maintain one indefinitely. Representative Thomas Massie, the libertarian-leaning Republican from Kentucky, whose opposition to the war placed him among the very few Republicans willing to break with Trump on a foreign policy matter, lost his 2026 primary partly because of that opposition, but the bipartisan Senate support for the authorization bill shows that his position has more company in the upper chamber than it did in his home district. The interplay between the executive branch ultimatum and the congressional authorization pressure creates a specific dynamic in which Trump's negotiating leverage with Iran is being simultaneously maintained by the threat of a permanent blockade and constrained by the domestic political reality that Congress is moving to require a form of approval that the administration has not sought and would prefer not to need. If the 48 hours end without a signed memorandum, we'll face the choice of resuming strikes without the congressional authorization that the Senate bill is moving toward requiring, or of accepting a further extension that the permanent blockade threat was designed to make unacceptable. Neither option is comfortable, which is part of why the administration is presenting the 48 hours as a genuine deadline rather than the latest in the series of extensions that the previous deadlines became. The specific mechanism of the permanent blockade, how it would be enforced, by which naval assets, at what distance from Iranian ports, under what legal framework, and with what response to vessels that attempt to run it, is a question that the ultimatum's 48-hour language does not address and that the administration has not publicly detailed. A permanent blockade would require the United States to intercept ships heading for Iranian ports indefinitely, including ships flying the flags of countries that have not joined the sanctions regime, and that would contest the American legal authority to prevent their vessels from calling at Iranian ports during a period when no formal state of war exists under international law. The legal and diplomatic costs of maintaining such a blockade would be substantial, and the governments of China and Russia and India, whose vessels and whose oil interests give them the most direct stake in the question of Iranian port access, have not been given any reason to believe they would accept American interdiction of their ships as a permanent feature of the post-war order. The permanent blockade threat is most credible as a negotiating instrument, as the cost that makes signing the memorandum of understanding more attractive than not signing it, and it is least credible as an operational reality that the United States can sustain against the opposition of the major economies that depend on Iranian oil and whose vessels would be subject to American interdiction if the blockade were genuinely permanent. Iran's negotiators understand this, and the question of whether the threat moves them in the next 48 hours depends on whether they calculate the immediate costs of continued impasse as higher than the long-term costs of the American terms they are being asked to accept. 48 hours is a very short amount of time to close a gap that 3 months of conflict have not closed. It is also, in the context of this particular negotiation, a longer amount of time than the 90 minutes between the April 7th 8 o'clock deadline and the 6:32 Truth Social post that announced the ceasefire, which is the historical precedent that tells you most accurately what 48 hours of ultimatum time actually means in practice. The distance between the 48-hour deadline and the signed memorandum of understanding is being measured right now in Islamabad and Doha and Tehran and Washington by the Pakistani and Qatari mediators and by Steve Witkoff and by whatever faction of the Iranian power structure has the authority to say yes. And the answer is going to come not on a schedule that matches the ultimatum's language, but on the schedule that Iran's internal political dynamics and the mediators' persistent diplomacy and the continuing economic pressure of the dual blockade together produce. Has given Tehran 48 hours. Tehran has given itself the time it needs to produce an internal consensus that its most powerful institutional actors can live with. The gap between those two timelines is the Iran war in late May 2026, and it is a gap that neither side has found a way to close in the 3 months it has been open. And the 48-hour ultimatum is the latest attempt to force a closure that the dynamics of this conflict have so far resisted.